Okay, we're live again.
How about that?
Let's give it a couple of minutes. How has your day been, Rabbi?
Oh, Hashem, busy, very, very busy.
That's good.
And one of the sad things is, we're talking about social care and things of that sort, that somebody in shul had a levaya today because there were too many people going. I couldn't go.
Really?
It's not the kind of thing that I normally do. I normally always go to someone's levaya. And, when we're talking about caring for others, it's part of what I feel that we need to do as part of our shul, as part of my rabbi as a job, as part of my job as a rabbi to do for other people. And yet with COVID, that makes things sometimes that much more difficult.
So because of COVID and the number of people there, you had to distance.
Well, there were two other rabbonim there already, so that we said originally that we try to keep it down to the numbers. I know the numbers were going to be up anyway because they're big families, but then you don't need a third rabbi. As part of my job as a rabbi to do for other people, and yet with COVID, that makes things sometimes that much more difficult. You double what happened over here.
Is that you? The number of people there. Just 1 second. You had to. Let's close that down. Oh, can you hear me? Right.
I can hear you.
I think we can get into it now. Sorry about that. Yeah. Right. So thank you for joining us, everybody. It is again Sunday night, 8 o'clock-ish. Sorry about the delay in getting into it. This week's subject is entitled the myth of Jewish affluence. And one of the things that has brought this subject up was a conversation that I had with Raphi Bloom of the Fed. And now, Rabbi, this is interesting because it's a bit of a crossover with your Chesed podcast here. So we'll probably make this content live on there as well at some point. But obviously the Fed tend to work with a wide range of people, even people that you might not necessarily already know of. We sort of think we're well connected and that we know everybody there is to know, particularly in North Manchester, things can get a little bit close sometimes. But Rafi's going to talk to us about his experiences, and we'll be talking about challenges in general with fundraising and other Chesed projects as well. So without further ado, I shall bring Raphi in. Good evening, Raphi.
Good evening. Good evening, David. Good evening, Rabbi. Everybody else, hi.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Raphi, to just give us, I mean, obviously you're a friendly, familiar face to most of us, but give us a little bit about your background.
I suppose I've been involved in communal side professionally for a number of years now. I was at UGIA for 4 years as the regional fundraiser before I became the director of fundraising and marketing at the Fed about 15 months ago. Before that, I was the deputy sales director at the Jewish Telegraph. I suppose that classifies me as working in the community as well. And obviously, I'm one of the founders and the co-chair of Northwest Friends of Israel, along with one of your esteemed congregants, Mr. Anthony Dennison. And that was 6 years ago almost now that we formed that in those times outside Kedem on King Street. So I've been involved with the community, very passionate about the Manchester Jewish community, about making it sustainable, about making it work for everybody, and about the longevity of our community, really.
And now more than ever, I think the sort of Manchester Jewish community, I think we're coming up for the another census in 2021. But without counting, we know that it's grown significantly in some sectors, particularly when we look at the more orthodox side of the community, commonly referred to as Haredi growth, if you like, in terms of Sedgley Park, Broughton Park. Those areas are having a boom, and obviously that we start to put some serious strain on communal resources as the community grows. It's fantastic to see a thriving and growing community, but it also has its own. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It is. I mean, the numbers in our community are open to speculation. Some people will tell you that our numbers are 25,000. I personally think that it's between 35 and 40,000, and perhaps the upcoming census will shed some light on that. Certainly what we see at the Fed is that the Jewish community, the people we help, don't just exist in the traditional neighborhoods that we would think of, such as Prestwich and Broughton Park and Whitefield and, Bowden and Hale. But we have people that we help in Rawtenstall, in Knutsford, in Marple, in Warrington. You know, the Jewish people live everywhere, and often these people are alone. To answer your question about the Haredi community, absolutely, it is, you know, I think nationwide, it's the growing demographic within our community, and it will place strains on the community resources. At the Fed, we do a lot of work with Haredi families. We have a lot of Haredi families that we help. Our cast, our social work team, our volunteer team work with a lot of Haredi families. Our children's centre work with a lot of Haredi families. But it has its different dynamic, as I'm sure a lot of people know, because often, you know, and this might sound a controversial thing to say, but I think the Haredi community will use resources that are available to them. But for example, from a fundraising perspective, I certainly feel that we don't get the support in return from some of the perhaps more wealthy Haredi donors in the community for the work that we do with the Haredi community. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed over the next number of years, because we need our resources to be funded properly in order to serve the growing needs of that community.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's not reciprocated? Because obviously we try and encourage. I mean, look, there's a live campaign on any given day. There's a live matching campaign going on somewhere. So obviously today, I know that Ride for Bonham, the AIMA Bonham ride has just finished today, and I've had several requests for that. I know that the Nikki Alliance campaign is on at the moment as we speak. So within the community, there are plenty of mouths that need feeding, especially from a communal resource point of view. And one of the comments I think that I had heard in a conversation about the Nikki was that they needed to try and access people from the Haredi community, because obviously they didn't want to be driven out of North Manchester by a growing community, which is fantastic to see. But why is that so difficult to bridge, that gap between sort of more secular, traditional Judaism and the Haredi community?
Look, I think it's a fair comment to make, to say that sometimes there's an element of, I wouldn't say mistrust per se, but I would say that we you know, we work with the Haredi community in many different ways. We often are involved with, you know, being involved with families that might have engagement with the local authority, for example, on any number of issues. And they, you know, and the Fed will act almost as the intermediary, if you will, and will represent the family's interests and to the council and to the family, so that those cultural differences can be bridged. Listen, at every point in anything that we do, the safety of any person that we're working with is a priority. So whether that's a child or an adult, whoever it is, their safety and is paramount to us. But often, you know, we can provide guidance to the local authority, we can provide guidance to the family on how best to interact, because often that, you know, you have two worlds coming together that don't necessarily understand each other. The community, sustainability is the key to anything we do in the community.
What I would probably add over there was, sorry about that. What I would probably add to that is that I think also there could we're getting rid of a double. I think I would add to what Raphi was saying, maybe that I think within the Haredi community, there are very few people that realize that the Haredim are big end users of the Fed. So I think if people were to speak to them and say, would you support the Fed? They'd say, look, you know, we got so many charities within our own camp, so to speak, to support, that we can start supporting everybody else's charities. And I know on your side, it's going to be very difficult to break that, because you have a confidentiality that you have towards your clients that's going to make it really difficult for people to see that there's this. But somehow, I guess, if you could make your way out there and let people know that it is actually a charity that is massively helping the Haredi community as well, you might do better with fundraising by them as well. I think that would be something you'd have to work on.
Absolutely. Look, anything that we do, especially with the work that we do in the community, you know, before COVID, we were helping and supporting 1 in 10 Jewish homes across Greater Manchester. During COVID, and now it probably went up to 1 in 8, which is a quite staggering statistic if you think about that 1 in 8 Jewish homes in Manchester require help and receive help and support from the Fed. And so a lot of the work that we do, though, as the rabbi said, is confidential, is very, very private. You're dealing with very, very vulnerable individuals and families. And so often it's hard for us to really show the work that we're doing and explain to people the work that we're doing. And that is even more so within the Haredi community, as the rabbi rightly says. So that's a job for us. That's a job that's a task that we're aware of. We know we have to do it. We work on that, and we'll continue to work on that. But going back to the original question, the growing demographic of the Haredi community is something that the Manchester Jewish community as a whole has to address, and has to look at, how we as a community come together, understand that segment of the community, plan for provision for that part of the community, and fund it effectively. You mentioned a number of different campaigns that are going on at any given time. Look, the Fed is the largest Jewish social care charity in Manchester, and we have about a £1.3 million deficit every year that we have to fundraise to bridge. And our community services side of that is about £500,000. And if we don't find that money, then our beneficiaries, whether those are residents at Heathlands or whether those are the 1 in 8 homes in the community that we're helping, they will suffer. And I think that, one of the things that I've tried to champion, and I know my board of trustees and our chief executive, Mark Cunningham, are very, very keen about, is cooperation, collaboration, and sustainability. And from a fundraising perspective, we're fundraising from a relatively small pool of donors. Manchester is not the biggest community in the world. It's nothing like London, for example, absolutely nothing like London. And so we have to look at sustainability. We have to look at value for money. And that's what the Fed did. When the Fed became the Fed 10 years ago with its merger, it was about bringing together cost bases. It was about bringing together service provision, cutting overheads, and providing a better service and better value for money. And I think the community as a whole has to look at doing that if we're going to, continue to provide what we need to over the next 10 or 20 years, especially with the economic downturn that we know is coming, and the problems that will arise from that in fundraising as well. So it's all about sustainability, it's about cooperation, and it's about value for money. It's about making the money go to help the most amount of people.
It's interesting that you say that, because if you were to look at the Fed today, or sort of to localize it, if you were to look at Heathlands today, and I know the Fed is very much more than just Heathlands Village, but it's a great showcase for what we're capable of when we get our act together as a community. But if you were to look at Heathlands today and the way that it's run and presented and the standard of the facilities, and compare it to where it was 10, 15 years ago before this great merger, then for all the stick that the Fed gets, and I know that sometimes, I'm sorry, but this is me being nasty to you now, because I can't just have this as an advert for the Fed, okay? You evil people serving 1 in 8 homes in the community, shame on you. When you look at the work that the Fed does, they really did go in terms of its marketing and its presentation to the community, and what it did with Heathlands, just from the very simplest things, which is as you come into Heathlands, in the old days, I don't know if anybody can still remember this, but I used to volunteer there when I was still at Jewish Grammar. And when we went in, there was always a line of pensioners all lined up sat against that wall. And they would always, and they were just that's how they used to spend their day in the entrance hallway there. And it was one of the, it could have been for children visiting their parents, that could have been quite a harrowing experience to see them just in God's waiting room, as it was affectionately referred to. But it's night and day if you were to go there today and to have a look at the dignity with which people are treated and the activities there. It's very much more than just a waiting room, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting because when you take Heathlands, and obviously that's the other side of the care provision that the Fed offers, alongside the community services, is that 10 years ago, the average age of a resident coming into Heathlands was 80 years old, and they were coming in with one complex medical condition. If you fast forward a decade, the average age of a person coming into Heathlands now is 90, with 4 complex medical conditions. So the provision of care that we've had to provide has had to change drastically. More and more people, sadly, tragically, are coming in with dementia, different levels of dementia. And we've just opened this week. We've just finished our new Willow Tree House dementia household, which is an extension of Beach House, which is, cutting edge dementia care for our residents. But when you think about everything that we offer, which is assisted living at Moorview, residential care, dementia care, nursing care, elderly mental illness, end-of-life care, a discharge to assess unit in conjunction with the National Health Service, it really is the jewel in the community's crown. And we feel very much, for us, it's about the dignity of our residents. It's not about our residents coming in. I mean, I don't like the phrase God's waiting room at all.
No.
But you know, some people might say that our residents are institutionalized. I mean, that couldn't be further from the truth. At the end of the day, the level of activities, of stimulation, of things that we do with our residents to keep them active means that they are anything but institutionalized. They are vibrant human beings. And in fact, one of the challenges that we've had over COVID, during COVID, has been, apart from obviously keeping the village safe, and we have tragically lost a number of very dear residents, is that families obviously haven't been allowed to come and visit their loved ones. They weren't allowed for 3 months. No volunteers were allowed on site. But our activities team and our care staff and our nursing staff worked tirelessly to keep the motivation of our residents, you know, at a very high level, because on the one hand, COVID is a very dangerous disease to elderly people, but so is lack of stimulation and lack of effort and lack of motivation. And so we've worked really, really hard to do that. And like you said, you only have to come into our activity room, come into our sunny lounge, come into our, you know, hear the Nordhoff Robbins music therapy that we do with people, listen to the choir, look at, you know, watch them playing golf and bowls on the lawn, and you will see that they are living a vibrant life. And that for us is everything that we do. A healthy, safe, vibrant life is key. And I think my colleagues do an amazing job. I really do.
No, I would second that. I think it's to look at it. Yes, to use the phrase that I used was uncharitable and unkind. However, it's very much how it would have seemed 15 years ago, and now it's a different place. It is absolutely night and day. But that's really the double-edged sword, because as more professional as the Fed gets, and in terms of in order to raise money on the level that you need to try and sort of bridge that deficit of very often, it fluctuates, doesn't it? So it could be as high as £2 million on a bad year. In order to raise that kind of money, you need a marketing department. You need, and that's what you head up there. And to churn out messages constantly to the public, showing them the work that you're doing, trying to highlight what actually goes on. I mean, I saw several of the posts today. You had some infographics with how many hours of phone calls were made in order to keep in touch with people during COVID. So these are fantastic statistics, and people, obviously, the public need to see it.
Yeah.
But there's also donor fatigue. There's getting that message too often, and people saying, "Oh, the Fed are everywhere. They're all encompassing. I can't cope with this anymore." How do you balance that?
It's a very real problem, and you don't want people to switch off from you. But at the same time, it's really important that they understand what you're doing, because on the Heathland side, from a marketing perspective, you know, we can show and we can, you know, tell people many, you know, as often as we can, you know, the great activities that are going on there. In the community side of things, as I mentioned before, often we can't show what we're doing because it's very private, it's very confidential, it's very emotional, it's very raw. So one of the things, for example, so we have to use more marketing tools to tell people what we're doing. And it's also important that people understand what's out there, because I think a lot of people don't realize the need that is out there. So the marketing material is not always asking people for money. You know, you won't see on every post or every message that we send out, or every email that we send out, please donate money to the Fed, as great as that would be. Yeah. It's also about telling people we are here for you. This is what we do. These are the type of things that we help people with. Come to us when you need help. You know, during COVID, the phone calls to our support line went up by 58% because people didn't know where to go for different things. So the marketing is not just about raising money. It's also about telling people what we do and why we're here for them and why we are the community safety net. So it's a hard task. And then you also have other things. You know, it's an interesting question that you ask, because often, you know, you might talk to younger donors and they will turn around and they will say, you know what, giving to older people doesn't really do it for me. I can't relate to that. I'm in my 30s. I've got 2 young kids. I don't really get that. tell them that families often have to choose between buying food for their children or a bed for their children, or they don't have fridge freezers in their homes. And they'll say, oh, okay, hold on a second. I go upstairs, I see my 2 kids sleeping in a nice, warm, cozy bed. I open up my big fridge, it's full of food. That's something that I want to help with. So it's a very, you have to be very dynamic, and you have to understand who you're talking to and the message that you're getting across and what message you're doing and giving out. As an example, a social worker, for example, one social worker will probably have a caseload of 100 families in a month, okay, or 100 individuals or households. It could be families, it could be individuals. Over the course of a year, they could help 1,200 people with critical things. It could be mental illness, it could be anxiety, it could be benefit claimant. A lot of people don't know what benefits they can claim. Yeah. Now, if you think about value for money, a social worker could cost £35,000 a year. But when you think about the cost, the return on investment, if you will, the social impact of funding a social worker, it's not, the ripples of the pond, because if you can help families to eat better and to sleep better, it means that their children perform better in school. It means that they form relationships better. It means that they have better life chances. And it means that later on in life, there's less chance that those children will need to use services such as the feds again, and they can lead productive lives themselves. So often when you're talking to a donor who could be a businessman or an entrepreneur or a professional, they can understand that it's not just about the here and now, but the ripples of the pond go significantly wider than just the here and now. And so there's many different ways that we have to tell our message. And I think I'd like to think we're quite good at it, but we can always get better. We're always trying to innovate. I've got a great marketing team, a great fundraising team, and our board of trustees are absolutely out of this world.
They're pretty hands-on, aren't they?
They are very hands-on. So it's about understanding who you're talking to and trying to, you're right, we've got so much to say sometimes that it's hard to say it all. We're not just a one project organization, if you will. And that's a challenge. But we have to continue trying to tell the story.
We're going to have a look at some of the comments that have been made, and sorry, they may take us back to earlier things that we've been discussing. We were discussing about that bridge to the Haredi community and being able to talk about the work that you do there. And Kate Laurie's suggested, perhaps if anonymous statistics were released that highlighted street names or areas, that would give them an idea of who it is that you're serving. And Rodney Barkley, there are plenty in our community who do donate to AIM Habonim and the Fed, but hardly any in the Haredi community who would donate to the Fed, even though they know that it's accessed by many in their community. And that's one of the things, the challenges.
Rodney has a far longer history with Heathlands and the Fed than I do, and he's absolutely right. But it's a challenge. It's hard. Sometimes in fundraising, you need to have a door opener. You need to have somebody that can make the introduction to the right person for you. It's not just about marketing with slick marketing material. Sometimes it's somebody who knows somebody. I don't know. It's a challenge that we face. Look, it's a challenge that we face because the Haredi community's use of our services is only going to grow because that part of the community is growing exponentially. Our services cost money because we run at a deficit, so we have to bridge that gap somehow, and it's something that we're very much aware of.
You keep saying that you run at a deficit, and again, I know it's a little bit controversial to talk about the Nicky's deficit on the day that they are trying to raise funds to save the place. But when we look at deficits by charities, surely by very definition, charitable organizations are not money-making enterprises, are they? So I'm going to look at some of the comments now, which will then lead us into further discussion on it. I'm just going to look at Esther Bitan-Spitzer. If you remember, Rabbi, I spoke about this topic. I'm presuming this is from Modi. I spoke about this topic one Friday night in Shul. The statistics are readily available. I'm ready to share with anyone if they contact me privately. More Jewish charitable donations go to non-Jewish causes than Jewish causes. According to the JPR, the more religious a Jew is, the more likely they will give to Jewish causes. Haredim give mainly to Haredi causes, charities, because he's explained that's insular, and the wider community tend to give to non-Jewish causes, outward giving. So both sides need to adjust a little. That's an interesting perspective. Rabbi, if you've discussed that with Modi, do those statistics stand up to scrutiny? The rabbi's having some.
Well, I don't know the statistics in the still having intermittent issues. Should have come to your office again.
You're welcome
sorry.
to.
They were supposed to reinstall. They were supposed to install a new router on Friday, and I guess they did. When I got in touch with Steve Durbin, he said they didn't do it. They were only doing it tomorrow, which is why I came to the office thinking that my internet will be working again. It went down during the thunderstorm, and we've had issues with BT ever since.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, go ahead. We can hear you.
Did you hear that, or did you not hear that either?
No, we heard that. We heard that.
Okay, I'm not sure if you guys, that's what I'm saying. I just don't know if it's coming through or not. I would say I don't know enough about the charitable giving in the more traditional sector, but I would say certainly the charitable giving in the charity sector is very much an insular kind of giving, that they give more to their own causes than giving outwardly to any of the causes outside them. That's why, from my experience, what I would say.
Okay, we're going to make some progress with some of the other comments as well.
Can I just, David? Can I just come back on that one comment that Modi Spitzer made? I would disagree that the mainstream community give more to outward causes than they do to Jewish causes. I'm not saying that people don't, but certainly the donors that I work with, and in fundraising, that could be a major donor. It could be somebody who gives you, £25,000 a year. It could be somebody that somebody that gives you £10 a year. But by and large, the donors that I work with are very, very supportive of Jewish causes. Absolutely, I'm sure many give to general causes as well, whether that's cancer research or the Macmillan or whoever. But it is true that the Haredi community is more insular with their giving. But I would disagree that the mainstream community give more to sort of non-Jewish causes than to Jewish causes.
Okay, we're just going to have a look at some more comments. One of them is from Laura Greenberg. Good evening, Laura. Thanks for watching again. And she's mentioned no one in their right mind could afford it. So what Laura's referring to are care home fees. And then now this is, Laura, I can tell you, because I know about this, this isn't just Heathlands Village. In fact, it is pretty much every care home in the country that when you are to tot up the bill for services, it's somewhere in the region of about £3,000 a month for an average person to reside in a care home. Is that not right, Raphi?
It's actually probably more than that. I mean, Heathlands probably averages around £50,000 or £51,000 a year if you're paying your fees to us. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. But actually, let me just give you, let me break that down a different way to you. Do you know how much that is per hour over the course of a year?
You're going to tell me.
It's about £5.65 an hour. Okay. Right. That's for somebody to come in, to be looked after, not necessarily one-to-one care, but certainly, a lot of care for that person. It can be medication, it can be food, it can be laundry, it can be activities. £5.65 an hour, which is a lot less than a minimum wage. So whilst it is a lot of money, if you think about what we're actually receiving to look after that person, when you think that we pay the national living wage, which is in excess of £8, closer to £9 an hour, it's not a lot of money that we're getting for the work that we're doing. If you think about it, no. If somebody qualifies for extra nursing care funding from the NHS, that works out to 99p an hour that we're getting to provide that nursing care on top. So it is a huge amount of money for people to pay. We are a charity. If somebody genuinely cannot afford it and the family cannot afford to top up, then we will take them in. But look at the way that it's funded by the government as well. So anybody who has an asset of worth more than £23,300 cannot get any local authority help for care for nursing home fee, residential care home fees. That pretty much rules out anybody that owns a house. Anybody that owns a property, it rules them out. If you do qualify for it, we live in the Bury local authority area. We get £489 a week from them towards this. Last year it was 478. They put it up by 11 pounds a week. That's about 7p a day, something like that. I think it's yeah. I mean, the national living wage went up by about 30p an hour, I think, and this went up by about 7p an hour, something like that. So we don't get any particular government help to look after our residents. They either pay for themselves, or the family top it up, or we are, or they come in because they can't afford it, and we're a charity. And so, you know, a lot of our deficit goes towards the Heathlands side of our operation. Probably 2/3 of our deficit goes to funding the care of the 180 odd residents that we would have in Heathlands at any one time. The other 33% goes to fund our community services that will help thousands of people every year. So you're right that it's a lot of money, but actually when you break it down and you look at what it is that we're getting in the care sector, it's, you know, it's not a significant amount of money, although it is. I just came across a new care home that's opened up in Cheadle last week. My chief exec told me they're charging £1,600 a week. Our average cost is about 950.
It's interesting. This echoes a comment here from Clive Moss-Barkley. Good evening, Clive. Funding social care, he doesn't mean symbolic, he means shambolic. We need a unified health and care budget. The government is committed to address this urgently, but don't hold your breath. And this is it. There's so many broken promises. It's one of the first things that newly elected politicians always do. They run to that very safe position of saying, look, we're going to back the NHS, we're going to back social care, and so much focus during lockdown and COVID has gone into the fantastic work that the NHS is doing, but that is obviously echoed, and those ripples go further into the fantastic work that social care workers are doing on a daily basis as well. And we've got areas of mental health funding that has been cut, and all the different services, the myriad of services that we have to provide as a society. Forget about as a Jewish society, but as a society period. And there just isn't enough funding to go around, is there?
There isn't enough funding to go around, and obviously, you know, as a Jewish care home, you know, we are committed not just to looking after our residents, but looking after them in a Jewish environment that, you know, allows them to live according to the ethos that they've lived their life by. We run under, you know, Orthodox auspices, and that's an important thing as well. You know, that also we're not, you know, we have extra costs like anybody who runs a Jewish organization, and certainly runs a kosher Jewish organization. You know, we have all those extra costs on top as well. So for us, from a fundraising perspective, you know, we owe it to our elderly to give them dignity in their later years of life when they're not able to live at home or be cared for at home. And at the same time, you know, we care for 5 times as many people on a monthly basis outside of Heathlands as we do in Heathlands. And that need is only growing as well. You know, the desperate need that's out there is only growing as well. And so when you say charities run at a deficit, every charity starts off from a point of a deficit, because they say, right, we want to raise as much money as we can to fund the programs that we do. They don't have an income. We do have an income stream coming in. Of course we do, because we have residents who are funded or self-funded or funded by the local authority. But that's not enough, and it never will be enough. And then the other thing, of course, that we've not mentioned is the capital side of our organization. We have to replace a boiler for a building that looks after 180 people. We have to fix all the windows, for argument's sake. We have to do this, we have to do that. We have to, you know, renovate an entire floor of rooms. That's an extra cost that we have as well. So the needs are ever growing. And that's why I come back to the point I made at the beginning, that, and I'm not just talking about the Fed, but I'm talking about, you know, whether you're talking about charities that deal with learning disabilities, or you're talking about charities that deal with cancer, or whoever it might be. Consolidation is what will sustain our community in the future. I really believe this, because if everybody goes off and does their own thing, and this isn't about, you know, the Fed wanting to take over everybody and do, and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm just saying is from
you beat me to that question.
Yeah, from a strategic point of view, this is about the sustainability of our community. Because if everybody goes off and does their own thing, you know, that pot of money is going to dry up, and then the community will be poorer for it in terms of social care provision, educational provision, health provision.
But just to push you on that, one of the comments that you do get, and again, it's not particularly nice, but the Fed, because they have so many fingers in so many pies, in terms of you are servicing 1 in 8 Jewish households within the community, and you are pretty much responsible for our social care on a day-to-day basis. And you will be the first port of call if we've got a problem on that. And yet, that's one of the things that people will comment, that the Fed have swallowed up quite a lot of the services. Now they don't get the full picture of the history of how social care evolved in Manchester, particularly Jewish Manchester, where all of these organizations were one and the same back in the day when you had the Board of Jewish Guardians years ago. And all of these organizations have a very similar lineage and heritage. And if the Fed do get criticism, sometimes it's that they're too overreaching, but you've got to bring everybody together in order to gain traction and to get those results.
Yeah, I would disagree that we're swallowing everybody up and that we're overreaching. I think that we help those who are most in need and most vulnerable in our community, and we have the professionals. I'm not saying other organizations don't, but we have the professional skill set, we have the organizational structure to be able to do that. I work with an incredibly talented team of our community volunteer coordinators, our social work team, our director of community services, who understand, there's lots of things that you have to understand when you're dealing with vulnerable people: safeguarding issues, statutory reporting, what you have to do. You just can't decide GDPR. You just can't decide that you're going to go and help people without taking into account safeguarding issues, the legal requirements that you have to reform to inform the local authority and the police if you think somebody is being groomed or abused or is at risk. So it's great that people want to help and get involved and start this up and start that up, but you've got to think about the legal framework that you're doing it in and how you do it, because otherwise you can cause more problems for that person and people's lives really can be put at risk. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing that I would say is that since COVID, one of the things that I've been part of that's been incredible is that there's been a weekly, it was twice a week, now it's a weekly call amongst a whole host of welfare organizations that was brought together by Mark Levy of the Jewish Leadership Council and Amanda Bomstick of the CST, who've done a fantastic job, and the Rep Council, where we've all sat down and we've spoken about issues to do with social distancing, to do with getting the message out to the Haredi community who might not have TV and internet and social media and know about what the government guidelines are, and that you can't have a minyan and that you can't do this and you can't do that. And it's been, you've had Misaskim on the call, you've had Solar on the call, you've had Shomrim on the call, you've had Rabbi Robin Ashworth-Steen from Jackson's Row on the call.
So you've got both spectrums.
You've got everything, every spectrum in between. You've had L'chaim Food Bank, and one of the things that has come out from that, for example, has been the coordination that has happened. So, for example, we've worked with incredibly with Michelle Ziffer from Herschel Weiss, who's a fantastic community professional. Really, just cares about helping the community. A truly incredible individual. And one of the things that came out from there, for example, is that the L'chaim Food Bank, Dobby Klein, who does a fantastic job in his own time, was inundated with requests for food. The food poverty was significant in the community, but he couldn't handle all the requests that were coming in. So what did we do? We said, okay, the Fed and the Herschel Weiss are going to be the front desk, if you will, for the L'chaim Food Bank. Requests for those people would come into us and Herschel Weiss, and we would triage them. Can they afford food? Yes, okay, then maybe we can help them with this and we can help them with that. Can they not afford food? Okay, they come to L'chaim. And what that also enabled us to do was also identify other issues that these families and individuals who were making requests for food might have had as well, whether they were isolation issues, mental health issues, anxiety, learning difficulties amongst their children. So it enabled us to triage these people that were coming to us for help, most desperate type of help, not being able to put food on the table for their kids. So that's an example of community collaboration that has been fantastic, really, really good. We need more of that, but at the same time, we need to be aware that our fundraising pot as a community is shrinking, and I say that because there are challenges. There's we're facing uncertain times economically. And it's really important that we get value for money in anything that the community does. We have to almost, and that's one of the things that we do at the Fed, is you have to treat your charity almost like a business. I know a business wouldn't run at a deficit year after year, but you have to get value for money in the services that you offer. And you have to look at, okay, I'm raising this sort of money, I'm helping X number of people. There has to be that analysis done, cost benefit analysis, if you want, or needs analysis done by every charity before they go out and raise money, because otherwise the money will run out.
Okay, we're going to have a look at the money side of things, and we're going to get into that. And obviously, we're going to read some of the comments as well. We're going to let Raphi drink some water there. Sorry, we're going to wear you out tonight. But we're just going to. I'm going to backtrack, and we're going to look at some of the different comments. Rodney, again, even when I was president of Heathlands, we tried so hard to get the Haredi community to cooperate with us, but they just wouldn't unless there was going to be an advantage to them, knocking our heads against a brick wall. Adam Shogger, I see so many nursing and care homes in the course of my work, and Heathlands is right up there, if not the best. There you go. Adam's a fan. Kate Laurie talks about preventative services. So when you look at social care, a lot of what you'll do is preventing problems coming up later on, which is very important. My sister Shifra, who is very right on, has said sometimes when you give to non-Jewish charities, they are charities that Jewish people as well as the wider community benefit from. That is very...
Can I just say that is very true? Obviously, heart disease and cancer is no respecter of race or religion. But what I would say is that if we don't look after ourselves, nobody is going to look after us. Okay,
fair comment. Chava Erlanger, she's got a tip for overcoming your problems in communicating with the Haredi community. I think the advertising has to look more Jewish if we want the former community to donate. It's all about marketing. Raphi, when will you be growing that beard?
Well, I'll take it on board. Listen, if it works, I'll do it.
You heard it here first. You might see Raphi sporting a beard. Here we go.
Advertising campaigns, though.
Sorry?
I think they mean the advertising campaigns. So
they do.
See frummer faces on the advertising campaigns, it might give people more of a feeling that it's doing something for their community as well.
Well, I think if you look at a lot of certainly the advertising that we do from our daycare center, you'll see lots of frummer or Haredi kids on it that are beneficiaries that we use.
Fantastic. Right, let's have a look at some of the other comments as well. Robert's asked a question which you've already addressed in one way, so you don't need to talk about it again right now. We're just going to go through it. Since becoming one umbrella organization, how has that benefited our community? Rodney sort of answers that for you. The fusion of Heathlands and the Fed was a perfect example of consolidation, which was for the benefit of the community.
Well, let me just address that very quickly as well, because Rodney is 100% right, and I will go a couple of steps further, and I'll explain why. If you think about charities with multiple buildings and multiple overheads, and you think about back office functions, finance, fundraising, human resources, all that sort of stuff, if you can bring charities, organizations together that pretty much operate in the same field or with the same beneficiaries, partly or wholly, the money that you can save is significant. And that money will then go to help more people in the wider community. So absolutely, there is a cost benefit for doing these sort of things that makes perfect business sense.
Phil Morrison has said, let's Shrubs add Heathlands to the Yom Kippur appeal this year. I don't know how much you've paid Phil to say that, but it was worth every penny. Thank you, Phil. I can tell you that's something that's being that's certainly being considered. And although I was asked not to sort of bring it up as a primary reason for us talking tonight, but it's interesting because traditionally the community has supported Zionist efforts, if you like. So there've been some organizations with which you're very familiar, Raphi, because you may have been involved with them in the past, that have benefited from Yom Kippur appeals, not just from our community, but from communities up and down the country. And I think that was probably all well and good in terms of the main focus of our money going over there at one point. But we've got that much need on our doorstep, and we're going to come back to that because that's the reason we're talking tonight, to challenge the preconceptions. But I'm just going to read through the rest of the comments first. Sheila Morris, at these difficult times, many charities need donation, and it's very hard to give to all. We're going to come back to that in just a second. Rodney has responded, to Laura. Laura had mentioned earlier that her experience with the Fed was that she noticed a deterioration in their particular case when it joined up with Heathlands. And Rodney's responding that it was never perfect and never will be, because it's hard to get these things entirely perfect. As Adam Sugar says, it's a lot better than anything else. And I think sometimes that's often what we settle for. But let's get back to the nub of the issue. The title tonight, talking about affluent Jews, it's very easy for us as a community, sometimes the anti-Semitic tropes that we put up with and that we've had to hear echoed throughout a very left-wing Labour leadership has centered around Jews and their influence and the fact that they control the media. It's only a Facebook Live, guys. It's not the whole media, okay? And they control, we're accused of controlling banks and having being able to pull the strings of politics, and everything comes back to money. That there is this misconception out there that every Jew is made of money, that we have tremendous communal resources. Now, if we ever dreamed or wanted to make an anti-Semitic trope true, the one that I would pick was, yes, I would like every Jewish organization to have tons of money and fantastic resources so that we could help everybody. But in actual fact, it couldn't be further from the truth. And one of the reasons for that is because we're Jewish. Now, one of the comments that I received earlier today, and they wish to remain anonymous, so they will, on the whole Jewish money thing, the problem is to be a Jew costs more than a non-Jew. Jewish state school fees, shul fees, burial board fees, kosher food costs a lot more, and Yom Tovs, each with their own individual costs to partake in them, a lulav, esrog, sukkah, Pesach food, etc. And then there's constantly the asking from charities. And Rabbi, this is where you rush in. But when we talk about chesed, it is one of the main principles of our society. When we educate our children, we educate them that giving to charity is more important, is one of the most important pieces of assistance that they can give to another human being. And yet we want to do all of these things, but we don't have unlimited pockets. It's one of these things. Today more than ever, everybody wants to give. There just isn't enough to give.
Well, I'm not sure, but coming back to the conversation that Modi had with me that Friday night, I think he showed some statistics that said that 1 in every 8 or 1 in every 10 pounds, Modi, you could probably put it into the chat if you wanted to, but 1 in every 8 pounds given to charity in the UK is given by Jews. Now, to consider that we are only 0.5% of the entire population of the UK, to think that 1 in every 8 pounds given to charity is given by Jews is absolutely staggering. So chesed has really hit home, and I think people do give way, way, way more than they have to, and way more than almost any other demographic out there. The problem is, as Modi said, there are so many causes, but also if you were to take some of the biggest givers and the biggest donors in the more traditional sector that have given millions to universities and millions to other things, if all that money somehow were to be stemmed towards Jewish causes, maybe we wouldn't have as much of an issue. However, as was said before, we live as part of a bigger society. There's no way that we can just turn around and say we will only give to Jewish charities and, charities, as Raphi mentioned before, cancer research, Macmillan, the British Heart Foundation, the Red Cross. I mean, all these people are doing tremendous work, and not just for the non-Jewish community. We as a Jewish community are benefiting from it as well, and we should also be doing our bit to give money into that. But I think if more money was going into Jewish charities, more Jewish money was funneled into Jewish charities, I think, Raphi, your job would be a lot easier.
Absolutely. Look, in most fundraising organizations, certainly in the Jewish world, it's different in the non-Jewish world, but in the Jewish world, 80% of your income comes from 20% of your donors. That's just a simple fact. However, it is important to give to engage with wider society on a charitable basis. I mean, our current trustee and our former chair for 10 years, and the person who initiated and drove through the merger to make the Fed, Mark Adelstone, is a phenomenal example of this. I mean, if you look at Beaverbrooks, his company, they've given, I think, something like £13 million from net profits over the last 20 years to charity. And he splits, he'll say this, he said this in a podcast that I listened to a couple of weeks ago, that his money is split between, pretty much equally between Jewish causes and non-Jewish causes, because he's a citizen of this country. And that's a fantastic attitude to have, and can only be a Kiddush Hashem for us as a community. But he also recognizes and he acknowledges that our community, as I said before, if we don't look after ourselves, nobody is going to look after us. And so we need to look at this. We have an older generation of donors in our community, our grandparents, our parents, for example, whose ethos it was, they grew up with an ethos of giving charity because that's what you do. Our challenge, my challenge as a professional, as a community professional, and our lay leadership's challenge is to engage with the next generation of donors to have that same ethos, because the pressures of life are different nowadays. We understand that. Very different to what they were in terms of people's own pressures on their own finances. And we have to find ways to engage with them to understand just how positive it is for somebody. Because at the end of the day, somebody who donates money, there's an incredible sense of well-being that they will achieve within themselves for making that donation, for helping other people. And so our challenge as community professionals and lay leaders is to engage with that next generation of donors, and to encourage them to follow in their parents' and grandparents' footsteps. It's not always easy, but it's something that we as a community, nationally as a Jewish community, have recognized. So it's a challenge, as I said, it's a huge challenge that we face.
I think also it's really important to realize that oftentimes it's not so much people's lack of money, but it's lack of appreciation of giving charity. Because I think if you look, going back to the Haredi community and what David mentioned before at some of these cause match campaigns, you're looking at campaigns of, King David had one campaign for, there's one campaign in the wider community for £1.2 million that just about made it to the 1.2 million. Last week, there was a yeshiva called Rav Tzvi Koshalevsky in Har Nof. They also hit 1.2 million. And if you think about the fact that one small yeshiva in Israel can do the same, and they have a campaign almost every single week, being supported not by the wealthiest sector of the community, but by some of the most religious people in the community, giving £5 or £10 again and again and again. If you could make your way in to the more traditional sector and get them to give in that same way, I think you'd stand a much, much better chance at filling your budgets.
I think that it's a really interesting point about these cause matching campaigns, because what you find is that often cause matching campaigns are run for very emotive reasons. The King David one was a classic case of, we have to have this money or the school will not survive. There's one today, we need this money or we're going to close down. You can't do those campaigns every year. It's not a sustainable fundraising model to say every year, we need this money or we're going to shut down, because ultimately people will switch off from that. What you have to transition into is a more mature and sort of organized fundraising campaign that engages with your donors, helps them understand what it is, why it is that you're asking them for money, why it is that their support is so critical, and explain to them things like I explained to you about the social worker. £35,000 a year. It's not just for the 1,200 families that one person is going to help this year, but it's about the future. The return on your investment is going to be in 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 years time, often with families with young children. So there's lots of different ways that you have to engage with your donors. You see it with challenges, for example. I've just spent this afternoon climbing up Pen y Ghent in gale force winds in Yorkshire ahead of the trek, the Fed's Yorkshire Three Peaks Challenge at the end of August. you see a lot of people, I'm sure everybody watching this has been approached by somebody to sponsor them for a bike ride. You mentioned Aim Habonim, the bike ride today, or for doing Tough Mudder, or for, you know, whatever it is, a sponsored silence. Those are people, the interesting thing about that is that those are people approaching their friends, and their friends are giving to them because it's them that's asking, not necessarily because of the cause. Yes, they look at the cause, and yes, if I went to you, David, and said, you know, I'm raising money for, I don't know, Islamic State, Chas v'shalom, God forbid, I don't really mean that in case anybody's listening into this from, you know, GCHQ. But you know, you wouldn't give to me even if you were my best friend or my brother or my whatever. But as long as the cause is good, not controversial, people will give because their friend has asked them, and then they'll go back to their friend in 2 months' time and say, I'm running the marathon, please will you sponsor me, and you'll feel obliged to do it. It's become a massive form of fundraising. Look how much money is raised from the London Marathon alone, and look how many charities have suffered this year because it's been cancelled. So they're important parts of fundraising, and you have to adapt to them, and you have to join in. You can't get left behind.
Do you think that leads to us giving less, though? So for instance, if I were going to give to the Fed once a year, one lump sum, but now I actually find that I'm being approached by 10 people, do I give less on average? Am I diluting that?
It's very hard to say. You know, it really is hard to say. I guess that's down to everybody's individual financial circumstances. But to build a sustainable fundraising model, you have to explain to people what it is that you're doing, why you need the money, and what that money is providing, and, you know, the number of people that are being helped, the type of situations that are being helped. I'll give you one example. I went, when I first started at the Fed just over a year ago, I went to see an elderly couple who lived in Crumpsall behind Heaton Park Shul. And I walked into this flat, husband and wife. She was, I think, about 76, 77. He was 80. And the smell of damp stayed on my clothes for the rest of the day. They had one son who was in a long-term educational care home. No other family in the world, no other family, no spouses, so no nieces and nephews, nothing. They were alone. The guy had worked, the husband had worked cash in hand his whole life, so he wasn't getting any pension. The lady was selling her jewellery at pawn shops on Cheetham Hill Road. They came to us because they couldn't afford food. We referred them to food banks. We gave them some sustenance parcels and things like that. And this woman's sitting here, and she's so dignified. You know, you walked into the kitchen, the doors were hanging off the cupboards, the bathroom looked like something out of a squat. And I thought to myself, this woman is the same age as my mother. I mean, it just kept me awake at night. What we did was that we went to bat for them with the Department of Work and Pensions, and we managed to get them a pension credit of in excess of £25,000.
Wow, that's huge.
Now that changed their lives completely. That's just one example, but these people had nobody else they could turn to. You know, you and I could sit here with the rabbi and we could talk about, you know, our maybe our parents, our sisters-in-law. Your sister was on here before. We've got family in the world. These people have nobody to turn to, and the amount of people that we help who have not one other family member, never mind living in the country, just in the world, is tragic. And so you're talking about really the most needy in our community. So when we help these people and when we ask people for money, it's about us explaining to them why it is that every pound that they give us, you know, and out of every pound that we get, 89p is spent on providing services. So we run a very sort of lean and mean organization. And it's about explaining, it's about telling that message to donors, because we have to explain to them just how desperate the need is out there, and how those who can afford to give, whether it's small or large, really we're asking them to, because we're saving people's lives. And that is not, I don't say that, you know, glibly.
Yeah, no, that's very important. We're going to look at some comments now, just because there's so many of them, and there's a little discussion breaking out there in the comments, so we'll address it now. And it's such an in-depth discussion that it's hard to give time to everything, but we will do. We'll just go back to Laura Greenberg, who said that it was pretty good before it joined up and the funds went down. It got worse when the funding from the local authority reduced. And I think that's the story across that. It's not just the Fed, and it's not just our social care. It's across the country. That we forget that in 2008, which pretty much coincided, didn't it? More or less around the time when mergers were thought of first. but we went through one of the biggest recessions since the Great Depression of the 1920s, and then all of a sudden, we've got austerity, which we forget about because it's become a daily part of our lives. So we don't harp on about it as much as we should do.
As an example, I talked about our community services side, which costs us £500,000 a year to run, and 95% of that is voluntary funded. We have to go out and raise that money. And that is the side that deals with the 1 in 8 Jewish homes that will help, 1,800 to 2,000 people directly this year, and another probably 3,600 indirectly through helping the family. Because what you also have to understand is that when you work with a child in a family that might have learning disabilities or mental illness, and you take that child, for example, out for a day to our daycare centre, that gives respite to the rest of the family. So it's not just about helping that one person, it's about helping the entire family holistically. So we used to get council contracts, we used to get some funding for the work that we do. Virtually all of that has dried up. But everything that we do in the community, we have to go out and raise the money for. And as I said, it's life enhancing and it's often life saving. So yes, government funding has dropped also in the care sector, as we mentioned earlier, but specifically in the community side of our operations, that is something, we have to raise money for, or people will suffer in a big way. And I cannot stress that enough. And that's why you have to look at the service that you're providing, the cost that, do a cost benefit analysis, a needs analysis of it, and say, okay, it's costing us £500,000 a year, but look at the type of people that we're helping. Look how many people we're helping. Look how many homes we're helping. It's a good use of money because people are getting the help that they need, and it's so far-reaching.
I'm going to look at the comments again because we'll pick up on some of those. I'm not going to go into great depth on this one, but you mentioned that family is so important. So my sister's watching. She's given me a good bashing on my Corbyn bashing there. Shifra is a big Labour supporter, and she sees there's some bias sometimes when I come crashing down on previous Labour leadership. I think the difference there is, Shifra, that I found that the previous Labour leadership was too silent on some of its members who were obviously recycling anti-Semitic tropes, and indeed retweeted several things that can be seen to be anti-Semitic. But we're past that. Keir Starmer is doing a good job of getting rid of the deadwood there. Moving on, without wanting to be seen to be anti-Semitic, how would you respond to the new charity request for the building of new shuls, shtibels, and yeshivas, etc.? Surely, Raphi, that's just an echo of something that we said, that those institutions and those institutional buildings. So any piece of land, I mean, I could tell you this from a property perspective, but any piece of land worth anything in Jewish North Manchester is targeted for schools or for institutions, because we need housing. We have a housing crisis
Absolutely
on our doorstep as well.
Look, I would say to you that obviously I advocate very passionately, as you can maybe sense, for the Fed. I will freely admit that, before I came to work for the Fed, I thought I knew what the Fed did. I had a decent idea, but I didn't even, scratch the surface of what it is that we do and just how much desperate need there is out there. But that said, there are lots of other charities that do vital work. I mean, you mentioned Israel before and Zionist causes. And what I would say to you is that, I always used to say, for example, I say very often that we have 3 pillars in our community. We have the CST, who look after our security. We have UJIA, who, for example, in this country, look after the Jewish identity and the lifelong connection to Israel, which is so vital amongst many of our teenagers and our children. And then we have the Fed, who look after our impoverished and those in need. And it's really important, for example, that we keep that Jewish identity and that connection to Israel and the work that UJIA does, because if they don't do that, then in 60 or 70 years' time, we might not need a Fed, we might not need a CST, because the community will have, lost its connection with its Judaism, certainly in the mainstream community. I'm not necessarily talking about the Haredi community, which we started off this conversation with. So it's vital that organizations like UJIA are still supported. and the CST do an incredible job as well, and lots of other charities in the community. And you're right. Does every person needs to open up a school? Does every person need to open up a Stiebel? Probably not. But I'm not necessarily qualified to talk about that. What I am qualified to talk about, I hope, is the social care need that there is in our community, and the huge need that there is, and the fact that, again, I know I've said it before, but the community needs to think about consolidation, because if it doesn't, and that's not, again, the Fed wanting to take everybody over, it can be other charities that come together, but you have to have value for money, and you have to say, okay, can we keep on going back to the community year after year and say, we need this and we need that, or is there a more sustainable way of doing it?
So what would you advocate? I mean, obviously, look, this echoes one of the comments here, and I'm not reading them out in order, but so what are you advocating? Some sort of communal pot, effectively a taxation system where all of us give a certain percentage?
I'm not necessarily saying that, for example, a federated campaign in the way that the Americans do it would work in our community. So obviously, for those of you that don't know, in America, there are federations in cities, and they raise money centrally, and then they distribute that money to whether that's Israel causes or local causes, etc. So I'm not saying that we should have a federated campaign, but what I am saying is that we need to do a needs, and charities need to do a needs analysis. We do it all the time at the Fed, and we need to look at how money is best spent on a per head basis or a per need basis. Is there a need still for any particular type of charity? How much money does it cost to run? Is that a good use of money? Could it be consolidated? Could the back office functions be consolidated with another organization? If it's a school, for example, I mean, you've seen it with schools, haven't you? You've seen schools. Steve Court with a perfect example. Central Shul closed down. There was no need. There was a dwindling kahila there. The property was sold. The money went into the new entity. That was another example of great collaboration and co-joining of funds. I mean, okay, the rabbi's shaking his head. Maybe doesn't agree with it.
No,
but
I agree with that. Except for that money went to build a very brand new building. That I don't know if that was the point.
I'm okay. But so I think that we need to look at this. For me, the key is the sustainability of our community, and it's the sustainability of services in our community. And there isn't an endless pot of money, and there is a huge and growing need out there of people not just living in the traditional, Jewish areas, but as I said, we provided Pesach food to somebody in Han 14, an elderly person in Han 14 this year, who without that would not have been able to have made what she considered to be a proper Pesach.
And that connection to the community is vitally important to people that live so far away.
Yeah.
Even though that can be seen as a choice for them being stuck in those places.
And we look after, in a community, we've got 300 people over the age of 70 that we look after in the community. 103 of those 300 are over the age of 90. Through the My Voice project, we're looking after 29 Holocaust survivors, a number of whom have mental health issues, isolation issues, medical issues that we are providing, that don't have a lot of any family or very few family, or the family lives out of town. And so we're looking after them. There's a significant need out there in the community, families with large kids who have behavioral problems or learning disabilities, people that can't budget. You go into the house and the only word I can describe their life is chaos. And, so there's lots of different things that we do. One of my social work colleagues at the moment is working with a young teenager who has a potentially, could be is self-harming, and she's teaching this girl, this person, to self-harm safely. Now, can you imagine going home at night, putting your head on the pillow, and what have you done today? I've taught somebody to self-harm safely. We're dealing with a young person in the community who's being groomed with alcohol and sexually groomed. We're dealing with parents during COVID where abusive spouses has left, and they've been left as single parents with no income coming in, no help with the children. Parents that can't look after their children, and they're absconding at night, and they're leaving the home, and they're breaking lockdown, or they were breaking lockdown restrictions, and we're trying to bring in sort of coping mechanisms. And again, this is all the type of thing that I explained to you about, the return on investment, if you will, if you want to put it in business terms. What we do is not just, yes, often it's dealing with the acute nature of the problem, but it's also the chronic nature. We're trying to build better futures for people. And that's what the Fed does, and that's what it does more than anybody in this community. And that's why, you know, we have to still tell that story.
So, Raphi, obviously this is something that matters to the community and matters to the people watching tonight. We've got over 42 people watching at the moment, and they have been watching constantly for over an hour and 10 minutes. So I'm mindful of their time. I am truly flabbergasted and grateful every week when I find out that people are so interested in what we are saying and the topics that we're addressing, that they are staying on the line for so long. But we're going to, just before I hand over to the rabbi to perhaps give us that nice centered bottom line on chesed and giving, I'm just going to bring up one of Rodney's comments, which says, Raphi, please mention how valuable the contribution of the volunteers is to the services given. Now, no service can, for all the money in the world, it's the volunteers that make that service, isn't it?
Absolutely. Rodney is 100% right. And I apologize for not mentioning them earlier. We had, before COVID, 500 volunteers. I did mention our volunteer coordinator team, of course, but we had 500 volunteers. We had over 100 come forward during COVID to help out as well. And I think the statistic, the graphic that you mentioned, David, at the top of this discussion about the number of telephone hours of support, 10,750 hours of telephone support was given by our volunteers, one of whom is I'm proud to say is my wife. Was given between April, May and the end of June. I mean, that is a staggering amount of befriending, of making sure people are okay. In some cases, often not just telephone support, but going shopping for them and doing other things for them, taking them to hospital appointments, even during the height of the COVID pandemic. And our volunteers are key. They are our heroes. It's why we call them our Fed heroes. And we couldn't do it without them. And yeah, there's nothing else really to say to that, except to say that, you know, one of the things I would say before the rabbi wraps up is that, and I mentioned this as well, is that one of the things our social workers are often asked for, encounter with young families, is the choice between buying food for their children or a bed. So you've got 3 children sleeping on a dirty mattress on the floor, or families that don't have white goods, so they can't buy fresh food. I mean, this couple that I mentioned to you earlier, one of the things that they didn't have was a fridge. This was an elder couple, and they were
things that we take for granted,
and tins of food. And we, first thing we did was we got them a fridge, which meant that they could eat more healthily and more economically. So what I would say to you is that, you know, I had a really nice, let me just finish with this very, very nice story if I can. I had I was talking to a donor who shall remain anonymous, of course, a couple of months ago, and I was telling him this story about fridges, and he said, wow, is that really true? People don't have fridges? And it really is true. And he went home and he called me up the next day and he said, you know, I went home and I opened up my big fridge, I think it was, he told me it was an American side-by-side fridge or something like that. And he opened it up and it was full of food. And he said, you know what? I just took it for granted. And the next morning he called me up and he said, right, he said, I'm sending you this money. Please restrict it and use it. Next time your social workers need to buy a fridge for somebody who's in desperate need, use that money for a fridge. The myth of Jewish affluence is that every Jewish family can afford food and a bed for their children, that every Jewish family can have a fridge or a microwave, that Jewish families are not selling their jewelry. Elderly Jews are not selling their jewelry on Cheetham Hill Road at pawn shops so that they can feed themselves. This is happening now in 2020 in Manchester, in our community. The Fed is dealing with it. The Fed is helping these people. The Fed, you know, the amount of benefits we help people claim that they had no idea. This is what we're doing. And so don't think that we're a wealthy community. We are a wealthy community. We are, and we have some fantastic donors. But when we're helping 1 in 8 Jewish homes in Manchester, you know, go out on your street and count 8 homes, and, you know, 1 in 8 we're helping in different ways. That is a serious issue. And that's why we need to raise the money that we do. But that's also why that need will only grow. And that's why the community needs to look seriously at collaboration, sustainability, in order for us to continue to support these people.
Wow. Rabbi, over to you.
Okay. Right. How do I follow on that one? That's really difficult. Okay, I would say a few things. Number one, first of all, I hope that this internet is working again. That I think the myth of Jewish affluence also comes from the fact that somehow we like to maybe show ourselves a little bit more affluent than we are. I go sometimes to weddings and I go outside and it looks like a showroom for a brand new, some really expensive car dealership. You got a Mercedes followed by a BMW, followed by a Range Rover, followed by another Mercedes, and they're all 69, 68, 20 regs. Everybody's looking down at the different number plates and everything, which allows us to think it's that way. But I think we as our community, not just as the shrubberies, but I think as the community in general, we need to open up our vistas that bit further to say, how much can we really be able to help other people? How much can you give? Because it's really, if people think about it, you can give so much more than you realize. You can give. I remember having a conversation with somebody once in shul. This goes back a few years. But somebody once said to me, somebody came to me and wanted to create another collection within shul. And another member within the shul said to me, he said, listen, Rabbi, we collect every day for the shul. We collect once a week for Tomchei Shabbos. How much more charity can we be giving? And the answer is tons. The answer is we all could be giving a lot more. Have a look. See, I'm reading a book now about managing your money. It's all about where you decide to put your money, where you're going to have to evaluate. Something's going to have to give and something's going to have to lose. And sometimes you just have to start taking charity that a little bit more seriously and say, I'll go on a smaller holiday. I won't spend 50,000 pounds on making my child a bar mitzvah or a wedding, etc., etc. And some of that money will go to make other weddings. I know people that whilst they made a big wedding for themselves, paid for 3 or 5 weddings in Israel or 3 or 5 weddings here in Manchester of poor people to make sure that if they're marrying off their kids in style, somebody else at least can marry off their child. The Fed is doing so many tremendous things. I think part of what I was listening to about what Raphi said and some of the things that even I didn't know, even though I deal with the Fed quite a bit and I deal with Ethan's quite a bit, is the idea that you can really sustain lives. The greatest charity that you can do is giving somebody the ability to stand on their 2 feet. The Rambam gives levels of charity, and the greatest level of charity, he says, is giving someone a job. I understand the Fed isn't giving people jobs, and that's not their remit. I'm not saying that that's what you should be doing. But the reason the Rambam says that that's the highest level of charity is because you can create people and give them the dignity to then live their own lives. And I think that what you were saying before is exactly the same thing. If you give people tools to be able to live their life properly, you give people tools so that at one point or another, they will be able to have a family where they won't have the chaos that their parents had. They will be able to get away from that person that's trying to groom them, and they won't go through. And I know people that have been through grooming, that have then been through sexual abuse, and then have sadly committed suicide because of it. And if you can stop that cycle, you've saved an individual. You've not just sent someone to school, which is great, or you've not just given someone a lunch. You've actually saved that person, which is so much more than just the micro things that we talk about that your organization also does. And so therefore, again, I implore people to give charity to all causes. I think the Fed is an amazing cause. I think the Fed should be supported, and everybody should be supporting the Fed and the work that they do. But I think everybody can have a look for themselves. If you did, in the Haredi community, there's something called Maser. You give 10%. Think about it. Could you afford to give 10% either before expenses or even after expenses? Could you afford to give that kind of money to charity? Have a look at it and say, yes, every month that is how much I'm going to put aside, and that's going to go to charity. And it doesn't all need to go to the Fed. You can choose some of it to go to the Fed and some go to others. But if people suddenly started giving charity that way and started looking at all the money and said, part of the money that I make is not for me, part of the money that I make is for the community, I think our charities wouldn't struggle the way they do. I think not just the Fed, but many other charities would be able to support themselves. Our community would have better services. And like we say about the Minyan, and like we say about so many other things, don't expect that charity to be there for you when you need it, God forbid, if you've never been there to support it when you didn't need it. Right? We say that about the Minyan. Many times I've heard from people, come and support the Minyan now while there's a Minyan, so that when you have to say Kaddish, there'll be a Minyan for you. Come and support all these other charities. God forbid, there's so many people that think I will never need such a charity. Never say never. God forbid people shouldn't have to come onto your services. I prefer that everybody should be healthy and everybody should be well, etc., etc. But as you said, 1 in 8, that's a pretty good chance that somebody support it now and say, God, I've supported the work that the Fed does. please help me that I shouldn't have to become one of their end users. I should always be the one that supports it rather than the one that needs to use their services because I'm in shtuch.
Thank you, Rabbi. That's an amazing way to end off tonight's discussion. Raphi, one of the questions, you've got lots of thank yous here that you can see coming up on the screen now. But Raphi, for anybody, Shufra's asked, hi, Raphi, I'm looking to volunteer in South Manchester. How do I get started? Who do they call?
So we have a volunteer coordinator, Avital Gilby, who looks after our South Manchester operation. If you call the Fed tomorrow and ask to speak to the volunteer department, ask to speak to Avital Gilby, she can help you. We're actually just partnering with the Feynman Trust in South Manchester as well to employ another social worker because the need is growing significantly in the South Manchester community as well, and not just in the areas that I spoke about, but much wider field as well. So absolutely, we would love to have you as a volunteer.
And what's the number for the Fed?
772-4800, and just ask for Avital Gilby. And if she's not there, because a lot of us are still working from home on a part-time basis, then they'll get the message to her, and I will follow up as well and make sure that you were put in touch with her.
Fine. Adam Sugar has a long-standing tradition. He rushes in right at the end of the show to tell us how rubbish it was. So if you get Adam Sugar saying you were rubbish, that is the gold standard. It means it doesn't get better than that.
Well, Adam is a lovely fellow. I see him often in the gym during the days when we were allowed to go to the gym, and I'll have a conversation about him next time I see it and try not to drop a barbell on his head.
Thank you very much. And on that note, we're going to end off. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Next week, we're going to be looking at another topic. We just have to work out what it is. So tune in next week and we'll be looking at that. Raphi, thank you very much for your time. Rabbi Eisenberg, always a pleasure. Nice to see you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.